Napoleon didn't just conquer Europe with cannons, he conquered it with credit. So how did one man fund non-stop wars for 15 years without collapsing France? And why did the rest of Europe go broke instead? In 1804, a former artillery officer crowned himself Emperor of the French. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and within a decade he would control most of continental Europe. But here's the uncomfortable question most history books glide over. How do you pay for that? Armies require salaries. Horses require feed. Soldiers require uniforms, muskets, powder, boots, bread, and medical care. Warships rot without maintenance. Cannons crack. Supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles. And every mile costs money. Lots of it. The Napoleonic Wars were not small conflicts. They were industrial-scale wars before industrialization. At their height, France mobilized over 1 million men. Imagine the payroll alone. And here is the deeper paradox. France had just gone through the French Revolution. The monarchy was bankrupt. The government had defaulted on debts. The currency had collapsed. Inflation had spiraled. Financial trust was shattered. France was not rich. So how did Napoleon build the most powerful military machine in Europe? Tonight, we're going to uncover the 3 financial engines that powered his empire. And by the end, you'll see how one man turned conquest into cash flow and why the system eventually began to devour itself. Because this isn't just a story about war, it's a story about leverage. It's about risk. It's about the dangerous fusion of military ambition and financial engineering. And it begins with a country on the brink of collapse. Napoleon understood something brutal but effective. If you win fast enough, you don't have to pay for war. Your enemies do. After defeating Austria in 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon imposed massive indemnities, forced payments on the defeated powers. Austria paid millions in gold and ceded territory. Prussia, after its crushing defeat in 1806, paid even more. These were not symbolic fines. They were state-level, wealth transfers, art, gold, livestock, weapons, tax revenues, entire regions rich in resources. Imagine running a business where every competitor you crush must fund your next expansion. That was Napoleon's model. Each victory refilled French coffers, and it created a powerful cycle. Victory gives indemnity, gives stronger army, gives bigger victory, gives bigger indemnity. It was financial momentum. But here's the problem with momentum. It only works while you're moving forward. The moment you stop winning, the system starts demanding payment. We'll come back to that. For now, understand this. Napoleon's early empire was largely financed externally. France exported the cost of war. But he needed something more stable than battlefield loot. And this brings us to his second engine. Before Napoleon, revolutionary France had experimented with paper money called assignats. It was a disaster. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Trust evaporated. Napoleon knew something critical. You cannot run an empire without financial credibility. So in 1800, he supported the creation of a central banking institution, the Bank of France. This was revolutionary. The Bank of France stabilized the currency. It issued notes backed by metallic reserves. It disciplined state borrowing. It restored confidence in French finance. This was not flashy like a battlefield victory, but it was far more important because war requires credit. You cannot wait for taxes to arrive before feeding soldiers. You must borrow against the future. Napoleon reformed tax collection, centralized administration, and ensured revenues were predictable. He professionalized public finance. And here's the critical point for our modern viewers. Napoleon didn't eliminate debt. He managed it. He reduced interest rates by restoring trust, which is astonishing considering France had defaulted just years earlier. It's like declaring bankruptcy and then getting approved for a premium credit card within 5 years. That doesn't happen by accident. Napoleon demanded efficiency. Corruption was punished. Bureaucracy was streamlined. Tax farmers were replaced by state officials. Money began flowing reliably into Paris, and with reliable revenue comes leverage. But even with a stable banking system, France alone could not fund endless continental war. So Napoleon did something audacious. He tried to weaponize the entire European economy. By 1806, Napoleon faced a problem he couldn't invade. The island nation of United Kingdom, Britain's navy dominated the seas. French ships could not challenge it effectively after the disaster at Trafalgar. And yes, if you're wondering whether Napoleon considered swimming across the English Channel, probably not. Even emperors have limits. So if he couldn't defeat Britain militarily, he would defeat it economically. He announced the continental system. This policy banned European nations under French influence from trading with Britain. Ports were closed. British goods were embargoed. The goal? Strangle Britain's economy, force bankruptcy, crush the industrial engine, funding British coalitions against France. On paper, it was brilliant. Europe was Britain's largest market. Cut that off, and the British economy would suffocate. But here's the cliffhanger. It didn't suffocate Britain. It strained Europe. Smuggling exploded. Black markets thrived. European merchants suffered. Ports stagnated. Prices rose. And enforcing the continental system required more military control, which required more money, which required more victories. Do you see the trap forming? Napoleon's financial system depended on constant expansion and enforcement. He was not just fighting armies anymore, he was policing trade. And every enforcement campaign increased costs, including one catastrophic decision in 1812. But before we get there, we need to understand the emotional reality of this system. For France, it felt like stability and glory. For occupied Europe, it felt like extraction. Indemnities drained treasuries. Resources were redirected to Paris. Local economies were reorganized to serve French strategic interests. It wasn't just conquest, it was economic restructuring. And restructuring breeds resentment. The empire was financially sophisticated, but it was also fragile because it depended on obedience. And obedience enforced by force is expensive. By 1812, Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain to Poland, but cracks were forming. The continental system hurt Russia's economy. Russian elites relied heavily on trade with Britain. Enforcement strained relations. So when Russia began defying the blockade, Napoleon faced a choice: accept erosion of his economic strategy or enforce it militarily. He chose invasion. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was not just a military gamble, it was a financial gamble. An army of over 600,000 men marched east. Feeding that army required enormous supply lines: wagons, horses, grain, ammunition. And unlike previous wars, Russia did not pay indemnities up front. There was no quick cash injection. Instead, there was scorched earth. Retreating Russian forces burned crops and villages. Napoleon advanced deeper. Costs mounted. Winter arrived, and the Grande Armée collapsed. When the survivors returned, France had lost not only soldiers, but the financial momentum sustaining the empire. Remember engine number one: war pays for war. Russia did not pay. Instead, France paid in blood and treasure. With military weakness exposed, European powers united. And this time, they did not simply negotiate indemnities. They pushed toward Paris. By 1814, Napoleon abdicated, and here is the financial truth rarely emphasized. France did not collapse into bankruptcy the way revolutionary France had, because Napoleon had built fiscal infrastructure. The Bank of France survived. Administrative reforms survived. Tax systems endured. The empire fell. But the financial machinery remained, which is ironic. The man who funded his empire through discipline, extraction, and economic warfare left behind institutions that outlived him. Yet Europe bore scars. Indemnities shifted wealth. Trade distortions disrupted markets. States borrowed heavily to resist France. The Napoleonic Wars reshaped European finance for decades. This was total war financed through a hybrid model: externalized costs through conquest, stabilized domestic finance through institutional reform. Attempted continental economic control, it worked, until expansion stopped. And here is the lesson, the one that should make every modern viewer pause. Napoleon's system resembles leveraged growth strategies we see today. When growth is constant, debt feels manageable. When expansion slows, fragility appears. Empires, corporations, even nations, they all face this dynamic. Napoleon mastered momentum, but momentum is not stability, and eventually, gravity wins. So how did Napoleon fund his empire? Not through magic, not through infinite wealth, but through a disciplined fusion of military victory, institutional reform, and aggressive economic strategy. He made war finance itself. He rebuilt trust in French credit. He weaponized trade. For a time, it was genius. For a time, it was terrifyingly effective, but it required constant success. And when success faltered, the machine turned brittle. The empire fell not only because of military defeat, but because the financial logic underpinning it required perpetual dominance. And no empire can sustain perpetual dominance forever. History teaches us many lessons about power, but Napoleon teaches us something deeper about money. Finance is force, credit is confidence, and systems built on expansion must eventually confront limits. The next time you hear about war budgets, sanctions, or economic blockades, remember, 200 years ago, an emperor tried to bend an entire continent's economy to his will. And for a moment, he almost succeeded.